Hi, thanks everybody for coming in this rainy day. It means a lot because we thought it was only going to be like 4 people. Carlos has a back injury, that's why he's there and not here. But thank you so much, Aimee, Chie, Carla, for inviting me to be part of this panel and being part of this exhibition. Really happy and thrilled that I am part of it. El Dorado has been a theme that is basically part of all my practice in different iterations. And this one, it's a little bit more obvious because it's gold. But I've started, like growing up, I'm from Venezuela, growing up in Latin America, the myth of El Dorado is just part of your DNA. It's just there, it's taught in schools in different ways, it's cartoonish, so it's basically all my work is based on this myth. And in relationship to the work that is here on the screen, that is in the show, this is a series that started in 2016. It's about El Dorado, funny or coincidence enough. I was born, now that you told me to talk about myself, I was born in 1974, and at that year is basically by coincidence, it's what has been coined by scholars like the El Dorado of Venezuela, because it's when it started the oil boom. I have to admit that I found that later. But so anyway, I think it's a funny coincidence that happens at the same time. And then I started the series of El Amo because it has been very hard and lonely to be Venezuelan, a country that is kind of falling apart and that is full of like political and economical, social fractures, and that has basically changed my life, and that meant that I stayed here. And it's a very lonely experience to talk about all of that. And anyway, like it also sometimes feels a little bit irresponsible to make work of and futile of problems that are not anymore my day to day. I don't live there anymore, so I don't know what it is. So I don't want to say things that are wrong. But that's who I am. And then anyway, like I started as all of basically, I assume almost everybody, I like TV, so I used to watch The Wire, and as inspired in it, that's how this series started. Because in a way, it was like a detective saga that, trying to put all the points together, so I started to follow the money. And now it's easier to talk about Venezuela because we're used to demagogic rhetoric via Trump. So since the 2000s, that has been the rhetoric that has surrounded or has anyway, but that's what happens in Venezuela. So they were like, the mining extraction was not being talked about. And so Amo is a region that it's, to put things in context and just, now that we're intimate, please tell me when to stop or if there's any question or if I'm not clear. But in 2016, the government, started this area called Arco Minero del Orinoco, with Orinoco mining bow. To translate, the acronym of Arco Minero del Orinoco is AMO, which to translate that in English is master. And so that allowed me to have a word play to kind of talk about colonial practices that I think has not ended. And then I started doing all of the work of El Dorado via that. And the drawings that are here, I use text from the newspapers. I use all different kind of medias, like Al Jazeera, the versions of Fox News of Venezuela, the version of CNN of Venezuela, The Daily Show, everything. And I decided to make kind of chronicles because I think one of the problems of places in conflict is that so many things happen. And it's something that it's a term that has been coined called slow violence. And I kind of wanted to, and via my drawings, that's what I tried to do. And for example, in one of them, it's talking about how the government says as a victory that Iranian oil is coming, which is a totally paradoxically in a country that is basically lives because of oil exports. And it's not a victory, and it's actually a tragedy because the government has allowed the infrastructure to decay. And the other one, it's like telling how the price of the gallon of oil started being like around $15, which, as we know here, a gallon of oil is $3, and when it goes high, we all like freak out. Imagine if it's $15 with the salaries that are very low. And also it was totally surreal. It was a momentary thing, but it's via these drawings that I want to make chronicles that these issues continue. And the gold bar is a way how to talk about this. And I feel like part of the problem is that a lot of this, via the gold bar, I tried to materialize and make tangible as a problem that it seems abstract. So.
Thank you, Esperanza. Thank you, Chie, Aime, and Carla for the invitation. I apologize, I have to stand. I don't want to create any hierarchies or anything like that. It's really just a terrible back pain. That is why I'm standing. So my relationship to gold, I think, can be reduced to questions of extraction and colonization. I think a lot of the work that I have done in the past decade is looking at the ways in which the conquest of the Americas and the years of colonization defined the ethos of who we are as societies and countries. And a lot of the emphasis of the work, or one of the emphasis of the work, has been centered around the question of how sexuality and gender were also products of colonization, or the mindset of thinking about sexuality as something that should only be for the purposes of reproduction, and gender in very specifically binary terms. So the work that I'm presenting in this exhibition is the product of a research in which I was finding pieces of pre-Hispanic sculpture that depicted instances of homoerotic sexuality. So there were kind of random pieces I saw in some museums or in some catalogs, in some books, but oftentimes decontextualized, oftentimes censored by the absence of discourse. And but there were enough that it really sparked an interest in thinking about why the social sciences had very specifically decided not to study some of these works that dealt with very obviously with questions of the representation of homoerotic acts, but also the representation of things that had to do with the body and with sex. I was disillusioned to learn through, in the more mainstream catalogs and publications, how when there was a question of talking about sex or these forms of sexualities, it was only attached to questions of the fertility of the earth and notions like that are oftentimes associated with indigenous knowledges, but not necessarily addressing questions of the body. It was not only until I found the work of a scholar called Pete Siegel, who had been also looking at this in a very systematic way, that I started to understand there was really space to think about how the body and ideas of gender were the products of colonization. So the work that is downstairs, it's a piece called Nefandus. It's a video that looks at a collection of these objects and situates them in relationship to this etching by Theodore Debris. Can you go back to the etching? This etching by Theodore Debris that presents a group of conquistadores in Panama that have let the dogs loose onto a group of men that are labeled as sodomites and others hermaphrodites. So that this kind of very specifically depicted the ways in which there was a kind of religiously infused othering of bodies that did not correspond to the Catholic imagination around sex and gender. So based on this, and in contrast with the objects, this video, which is about 15 minutes, it's situated in the northern coast Caribbean in Colombia, and looks at the traces of, or the silence of the landscape. In a way, the ways in which the landscape is complicit with the histories of violence and erasure of objects and histories and stories. So I invite you to see it. I don't necessarily feel like I need to narrate the whole video, but it was the beginning of a larger body of work where I started to interrogate the lack of knowledge and the systematic erasure of knowledges around some of the objects that survived the systematic destruction of indigenous cultures. Now, the work is in no means wanting to point to the fact that there may have been gay or lesbians or trans people in pre-Hispanic societies. That is not my interest at all. Also, I have no place in doing that, as I have no knowledge of that. But to me, it was really about trying to trace back the ways in which there are loops of knowledge that are formed and processes of learning that were reproduced by the contact and the years of the colony. Can we see the other picture? Thank you. So this other piece, which is in the show, is the first one of what became a much bigger installation, where you see a miniature replica of one of these objects that I found. This one actually comes from a manuscript. Could you show the other picture? That's it. This one comes from a manuscript based on a Mayan manuscript that then I rendered as an object. So it was actually rendered. The drawing is very similar to the original, and then it was rendered as a miniature object. Then there is, of course, this magnifying glass through which you see the little piece. Can we see the installation? Thank you. Ultimately, the final form of this work became this room-size installation where you find 20 little windows that are made of plexiglass and exist behind glass, in which all of these tiny little figures are installed. They're about the size of a thumb. So if you want to see them, you have to come close and kind of rub your nose against the glass to see them. And all of these things are, I mean, the question of size versus the magnitude of the room, the elegant nature of the installation, the colors that are used, were all very strategically chosen. Because I wanted to also reflect upon the ways in which the institution of the museum and the edifice of aesthetics has also been complicit in the ways in which we legitimize some forms of knowledge. And in the case of the Museum of Anthropology, the Museum of Archaeology, there is an edifice of aesthetics that has been built around creating monolithic ways of relating to historical objects. So this room looks like this because it wants to look like a room that you would find at the Musée d'Orsay or the Louvre or the Met, because it through engaging the viewers with those conventions of museography, there is a certain kind of legitimization of content. But of course, the narrative here is completely arbitrary because it is a museum of homoerotic objects that is only a construct in my mind. It doesn't really exist anywhere else. But there is a kind of, solidification of the information via the way that it is presented. I don't know, is there another picture? Yeah. So this is what you see through the little windows. Maybe that's good.
Thank you so much, Carlos and Esperanza. I wanted to ask you questions about the mechanics of the work itself. Like, for example, for Carlos, this idea of inviting viewers to peek into the magnifying glass. If there is. I know that there is the issue of how we look at these institutionalized objects, yeah. But there is also an issue of voyeurism and secrecy and looking at something that has been deemed a sin, right? Right. So I wanted you to expand a little bit more on that. And Esperanza, looking at your works, I'm an art historian, and I know a little bit of Venezuelan art, and there is this entire history of Venezuelan art that is very much based in, especially in the 20th century, post-war years, rooted in this idea of geometry. and the relationship between geometry and economic development, etc. And I know that all that aesthetic language also grew with oil boom of the country, and this idea that the country would have like a bright, rich future because of all these materials that you extract from Earth. But not necessarily. I want to know if your work has anything to do with this legacy, or if not, like what are you looking at? Like the work itself is so precise. I wanted to talk a little bit about this format, the grid that you include in your works.
Well, that's a great question, and it's like I've thought a lot about. I mean, I can't get like it. I never really thought about the grid, and I did not study art in Venezuela. I studied art here, so I didn't become an artist there. So the grid just happened. So it wasn't like I was studying. I mean, obviously, you're from a place. You could see the public art, which is incredible in Caracas, and you go to people's houses. And yes, that's obviously in my DNA. But it's not something that I was like, oh, I'm thinking about. I wasn't at all. It just happened out of the blues, and it was totally like, okay, this is my legacy. I think that there's a commonality with artists from Caracas, that the city is very prevalent in our work, and that's why I wanted you to put this slide, because as you see in that work that is postcards from Venezuela, the one that is in the middle, you can see that Caracas is a very cosmopolitan city, and that or it used to be, and it's full of big buildings, and it's very oppressive, and it's very exciting. So I feel like artists from Caracas, like I feel like a lot of artists from Colombia, like nature and the I don't know, the rainforest is like very present, and maybe I'm wrong, but that's, as a viewer, that's what I see. I feel like, so that is all there. And the gold brick started, as I mentioned before, in a way it's talking about like what I think as our modern conquistadores. Now I'm going to my airy territory, that is basically the foreign mining corporations that were invited in 2016 by a country that has a narrative about revolution, but that doesn't sound very revolutionary. And also a situation which I don't understand why they brought in the foreign corporations when, yes, there has always been like small scale mining, but it has been demonstrated over and over again that bringing mining corporations into countries just destroy them as countries, and they destroy the rainforest, and that's exactly what's happening. And at the same time, with the bricks and the architecture and the grid that you're asking, when I started using the gold bar, it was a joke. It all started with a joke. Like it was like how to make a gold bar like tangible. So a gold bar is like, I see the price of gold bars basically every day. So the price of a gold bar is $69,000. So for example, to see in that stack that is really 95 gold bars are in that stack that is there in that photo, but to put it like 100 gold bars, which is almost that is there, it's almost $7 million. So it's like that can go in somebody's suitcase. So it's a little bit to put in context the root of gold and all of like the market. And at the same time, the reason why I decided to use bricks was a game with architecture. And a game was, and I don't have a photo of that here in the back, but they're done with gold leaf, but they're not completely, they're not covered all the time, and that's intentional. Also, in a formal way, I wanted them to, I mean, I don't want to make a gold bar, but it's also like, it's a way how to talk about architecture, like money laundering. The city, Caracas is full of like skeleton buildings that just never end up being constructed, which is, we're familiar with that in a way here, but no, that's intense there. It's like, because it's a lot of it is like money laundering, and it's all of this economy that it's kind of like, there's with the mining, the money flows, but it only stays with some people. And I believe that the oil, yes, there is also a natural resource, but it's a different story, because when the oil industry was like developed in the case of Venezuela, there was an infrastructure. And, yes, it is a problem in a way to be an oil country, but I don't want to believe in that. There's a theory that it's like there's like a natural resource course. So, like for example, in Nigeria, like Venezuela, et cetera, are countries that like we're kind of like have this curse, and that's why, because we have so many natural resources. But that's not true when you think about Australia or China or Russia or even the United States. There are also countries that have a lot of mining resources. So basically via gold, via the universality of gold, via this myth of El Dorado, I decided to like create my work and to try to understand the what was happening in my context. But I think my personal narrative in my context is universal, because what's happening in the deforestation and like the displacement of indigenous people, it's not a unique, and all of this abuses via military, via gangs, via transnational corporations, via elites that just don't care, like destroying a country just to get a personal bounty. That's not a unique story of Venezuela. That transcends Venezuela. That's something that we can talk about someplace here in the United States, and we can also talk about any place in the world. And for me, the question is like, and also via reading other activists and theorists, like it's to kind of not see these problems as isolated issues, because they're not. They're all interconnected. And it has been through these drawings and the gold bars and like via the drawings, via the canvas weaving, that I've tried to address all of this.
Yeah, so I mean the question of the miniature, the question of peaking, the question of shame, the question of guilt, all of those things were, of course, things I was thinking about. The idea was it was a very simple idea. It was to render something miniature and confront you with it in a way that it would become giant in your mind. Right? So when people come and have to put their face against the glass, or the image is amplified through looking through the magnifying glass, there is a confrontation with something that has been rendered silent and that hasn't really been talked about so much.
Yeah, that's amazing. I love the fact that, for example, this work, it's about creating a homoerotic history, and creating history is also creating narrative. But of course, we don't know the history of a lot of the people, the narratives of a lot of people especially subjugated, indigenous, racialized people that had to conform, that had their bodies, their selves disciplined by the Catholic Church, by the colonial system, etc. But in your work, which is it's very much about history making too, and you're looking at archives in some artworks. You're looking at this very old, these objects. They're all pre-Hispanic, they all exist in museums, etc. And I wanted to ask you, like, what does it take to reconstruct that history? How do you do that? What decisions do you make? Yes.
Sure. I mean, I want to be clear that I'm not really reconstructing any history, right? I'm making shit up. Like this is all. I'm sorry for the foul language. But it's kind of like that. It's an attempt at creating an arbitrary fictional narrative that would conform with the critique that I set out to carry on. So my attempt was not to claim stakes at finding the truth of anything. Because,
okay, so let me ask you another question.
No, but let me finish, because I can work with your question happily.
Okay.
So in that sense, I feel like that was exactly the artistic strategy here. It was to look at the arbitrary nature of how things have been described and constructed. So, for example, there's a whole other body of videos where I fictionalize legal cases that I found in colonial archives, and these are cases that would, for example, narrate the story of somebody who was deemed to be a sodomite or a hermaphrodite or a zoophile, somebody who had sex with animals. somebody who masturbated secretly, all of these things were serious crimes that would oftentimes lead to being burnt at the stake or exiled or to become a rower in the galleys, like really kind of atrocious things. So I was interested in who made it to the archive, right? So the person who made it to the archive had to have been caught doing something wrong, or what the authorities claim to have been wrong. So imagine you go about your business, you're having sex with your boyfriend or your partner, and they catch you. Then that is the moment when you enter history. If you had not been caught having sex behind that in the barn, you would have not made it to history. And now the question is, is it better to be absent from history or be part of history? So to me, it was interesting to take on the case, right? And see how the case, the object of study, the subject, all of these things that have so much weight and that we use, probably all of you use some of this language in your disciplines. Find me a case, find me, what is your object of study? What are you looking at, etc. All of these things are in the context of what we're talking about, in the context of colonial extraction, are colonial inventions. So I wanted to treat this in a similar way, a kind of defying strategy of giving a sort of freedom to the archive. So if Esperanza is a subject that has been tried, the life of Esperanza in history ends when she stops being named in the archive, in the case, right? So she has been freed because they could not prove anything wrong. And then Esperanza is free again. She doesn't exist within any confining narrative anymore. So one of the strategies of all of this work has been to imagine the life beyond the archive. So what happened to Esperanza after Esperanza got released? Or what happened to Esperanza after Esperanza served the prison sentence? Or whatever. Sorry to have used you as a case. You're the but so that is, you like it? Wow. Colonial fetish. So in that sense, that was the story, right? The story was, there is a character called Martina, and Martina is an early 19th century character that is tried for being a hermaphrodite because she defied the biological understanding of what a body should be. So what happened to Martina is that there is little proof against the claims, and she moves on. So in the film that is called Deseos, Martina then becomes a heroine of the independent movement. So in my story, Martina's life, that encounter with the legal system is a footnote, because what she does in my fictional creation of Martina, who was a real life person, is that she then goes on to help her own people emancipate and create a narrative of liberation. And so that is the place where I think art makes any sense. So it's not about creating another history or creating another dominant narrative. It's more about playing to find ways to free queer people from the confines of repression that we've been subjected to historically, right? So that is why I want to contribute in these ways. It's not to make you think that I know anything or that anything has been proved, because it would be presumptuous.
Yeah, no,
false.
I understand. There is a central role of fiction and fictionalization, imagination in your work. That is very important to imagine the past and also the future. And this is something that I wanted to ask both of you, this idea between the past and the future, and what is your relationship to the idea of progress? Because Esperanza, you're looking at the ruins of a country that imagines so much its future, right, but is in shambles. So what can we think about the future? And Carlos also, you're looking at the past to imagine, create other fictions and narratives, and I want you to talk a little bit about the connection between the past and the present. Maybe with a narrative of progress, maybe not. Maybe a progress is also a myth.
I use fiction in a different way than you. But yes, I feel like I'm a I'm just a storyteller, just a visual storyteller. Instead of making books, I make weird stories via art. And a lot of the photos that I have from the past are from personal family archives. But I mean, that's gonna sound a little bit Debbie Downer, but well, almost everybody's gone to not go there. So I don't really know the stories of these photos. I invent them. So for example, the photo on the left that it's over the brick, that's a very pivotal artwork for me in my constructed narrative, because that is a photo that it's called Untold en la Cepal. Untold was like, he used to be the director of the United Nations, and on the 1960s, like they're founding like this building in Santiago de Chile that is La Cepal, that is basically the version of the United Nations over there. And there is this economical theory that was very in vogue in the time that's called import substitution. And the idea was that all of these countries that like that have all this incredible natural resources, the industrialization will be in the country and not elsewhere, which is kind of what happens. Unfortunately, as we know, that utopic ideas failed. So if we go to the next one. So to continue with this, like the photo on the top, it's also a personal photo. Actually, the person on the left is my grandfather, and the person on the right is somebody from Saudi Arabia that I think it's like was the king or something like that. So I don't really know these photos. I know more about this photo because I was just in an exhibition and the curator found out who the person on the right was. So the photo is kind of irrelevant for me. What's the real story about them? Because my grandfather's dead. The other person, I had no idea who it was until like a month ago, and I don't really care either. Like, and I don't know if my grandfather would like the narratives that I am inventing. But for me, the important part of this photo, that is in the 60s when the OPEC was invented, and the OPEC was basically invented by Saudi Arabia and Venezuela. So that's why that photo is there. Then the basket in the middle, for me, is basically what will be, in a way, the present. Because it's those are baskets of weavings of a tribe called the Jacquana, and I, as a Venezuelan, and I imagine the Venezuelan people that are here, we all grew up with those beautiful weavings in our households and with hammocks, and that was part of like our DNA. So a lot of my work that looks like grids, people assume that I'm talking with a minimalist aesthetic. It doesn't come from there, it comes from here. So in a way, with my work, that I'm talking about communities that are being like taken from their land, like, you know, the area of Amo that I mentioned before is like 12.2% of Venezuela. It is, to put this in context and to not make this abstract, it's basically the Netherlands, I don't know, like I just forgot, but like 3 countries of Europe together. It's a very big area. So in a way, with my drawings, with the basket in the middle, and I don't know if I'm completely answering your question, but it's my way to answer it. Like, it's bringing the present, bringing this weavings. It's a way of like, well, if I'm going to talk about the displacement of indigenous community and all of that, in a way, it's an homage from me to them. And it was unconscious. It's not like I started doing my weavings and I'm like, oh, you know, it's afterwards I understood where it came from. And the envelope in the bottom, it's like this fucked up envelope that it's like, this says confidential economical matter, and it's just, for me, that is basically the genesis of all the work I'm doing right now. It's the base of all, and where I kind of create my fictions about the present and the past, if I am answering it.
So, I mean, following what I was talking about before, the question of who do we become if you manage to not make it to the historical account that reduces you to a case and an object of study. Like, then there is endless possibilities, right? You can be an angel, you can be a person in the present, you can be somebody who never lived. So to me, that was the strategy, to think of the future of those restricting narratives as new beginnings. And those beginnings could be anything, really. I mean, and also this is something that that pertains these works that we're talking about, because I have a whole other aspect of my work that is concerned with creating present-day documentary narratives. But it was in order to understand the issues that concern the communities that I have interfaced with and that I am a part of myself. I wanted to understand what were the genealogies of knowledge that created the language that we use to define sexuality and gender in the present. So, for example, this word sodomite that I have thrown around so much, it has a very specific beginning, and it goes back to the 11th century. It was an Italian self-flagellizing priest called San Pedro Damiano who coined it as one of the most terrifying sins against nature. All because there was no question of reproduction attached to sodomy. So after he uses that word, he sent a letter to the Pope at the time, and the Pope liked it. So it becomes something that is reproduced in the discourse of the Catholic Church. So to understand why people in Florida are not allowed to use a bathroom because they identify with a certain gender or another one, I wanted to really kind of go back and think about what were the origins of these forms of discrimination that became systems of exclusion, and that are semantic and linguistic and conceptually anchored in questions of religion and its relationship to the law. So that was that.
Amazing, thank you. Anyone has any questions? Thoughts? Jaime?
Question for Carlos. I think it was pretty striking. If you don't mind going back to the homoerotic slide, the blue on the wall. And you know, I think it's an accident because I don't think our exhibition designer saw this piece installed the way you had it installed, but she chose the same blue. So I wanted to, ask if you have any thoughts about the symbolisms of, this blue in particular, and the symbolism of colors as also codified systems that have a semantic.
I mean, I think if you ask somebody else, for example, Sewa Calfuqueo, who's a Mapuche artist, trans Mapuche artist working on representing histories of the Mapuche culture. This is a blue that Sewa uses for everything, and it is because it is the color of the Mapuche nation. For me, it is the color of the Anthropology Museum. So our relationship to the color is very different. In fact, Sewa and I had a conversation about it at some point because we've used it in different works. But to me, this is the color of, the kind of distilled color of the Musée d'Orsay. Like if you go there, you will find this shade of blue or the shade of green or the elegant shade of burgundy color, all in the same register. And to me, that is what I was invoking there. So there is no indigenous reading or any kind of any other symbolism attached to it.
But
in that way.
It's funny because in a way it becomes, because the lapis lazuli, I guess that's why it's like the Mapuche, and that's like mining.
Right.
So you knew it.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Carlos and Esperanza. You have a question. Great.
I have a question for Esperanza. You addressed the past and the present in your work, but I wondered if you had any thoughts about the future.
That's a hard one. Wow. You want the positive or the negative answer?
In terms of how you see your work addressing the future, or how you see that playing a role in where you go?
I don't know if I can answer you that question in a formal or like in the present. I mean, I don't really know what's the right way how to address it. And like in the case of my work, that kind of what you're asking? Yeah. I'll continue, like if you go to the, I'm working with the weaving canvases. I feel like in this series of Amo, that is master, and all the wordplay was it, and it's a total direct way was like post-colonial and colonial practices. I feel like the continuation is to keep weaving and to keep talking about it, because I feel like when I like that the work at first for somebody that doesn't know my story, and I think it's totally okay if somebody doesn't know my story. It's okay. Like we read books and we create versions of what we think the book means. I think that's my phone. That's the unpolite one is me. Sorry. So in the case of like that work, it's like the idea is to create weavings that are a way to keep creating my way of protesting what is happening in my country. And I like very much that, like, when somebody that is Venezuelan comes to my studio, they understand everything I'm saying. I don't have to explain. I don't have to explain almost half of what I just said right now. I don't have to talk about the gold. I don't have to talk about that. I decided to live here, and Chavez helped me. So I live here, and anyway, it has been very interesting to have to make a discourse that becomes universal. And I am into this idea that when people see my work, they first can just think I'm talking, it's a beautiful gold painting or drawing. I mean, that's what people think. And like people that are not into my history of indigenous like weaving, they basically first go into minimalist, Eurocentric artwork, which I actually love very much too, and it's obviously probably influenced there, but you know, Joseph Albers doesn't come, we know where he comes from now, right? So so I think, like, I love when people see my gold work and then they just think it's a beautiful painting, and when they know the story behind it, it's like this whole fuck-upness of a place that's falling apart. And I really like that contradiction, and I really like that narrative, and and my future is to make more and bigger canvas works that will address this thing that will kind of, in a way, via a lot of them, the ones that are, I have some that are just the grid. When you see them, they're like very meditative and they're very peaceful, and they look like if it was like the ocean, which is basically what I'm doing. I'm looking at the ocean via my anyway, I love that contradiction is there, and that you can think that I'm talking about, like, that's what gold is. It's beautiful. And I'm talking about this gold, beautiful thing, but where does gold comes from? And so that's my future. Thank you.